From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
After primaries Tuesday in Georgia, Texas, and Alabama, who won and who lost, and what does it say about the state of American politics? Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We're joined today by my colleagues, editorial board member Kate Batchelder-Odell and editorial writer Mene Ukwe-Barua. Welcome to you both. The biggest story to my mind coming out of Tuesday is this remarkable outcome in the two top races in Georgia. Governor Brian Kemp reelected strongly. Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger reelected strongly. Both those races had challengers that were backed by President Trump. And so let's start with a little bit of audio. Here's Brian Kemp declaring victory, and then his challenger, former Senator David Perdue, conceding defeat.
Conservatives across our state didn't listen to the noise. They didn't get distracted. They knew our record of fighting and winning for hardworking Georgians. And tonight, because of your support, Georgia Republicans went to the ballot box and overwhelmingly endorsed 4 more years of our vision for this great state.
We trust the people of Georgia, and we did it knowing that we were going up against an incumbent governor. And, everything I said about Brian Kemp was true, but here's the other thing I said was true. He is a much better choice than Stacey Abrams. And so we are going to get behind our governor. Bonnie, I committed to him right now what Jack Kingston committed to me back in 2014. And that is there's nothing they can ask me to do that I won't do. We're going to do everything we can to make damn sure Stacey Abrams doesn't take over the state.
So it's always interesting when the polls are wrong, and they both seem to be in one direction here. I'll reread the numbers that I cited yesterday. The Real Clear Politics final average for the Georgia governor's race had Brian Kemp at 55% of the vote. Instead, the returns say he has, as of right now, 74%, which is an overwhelming victory. The Secretary of State's race was a little more spotty on the polling, but yesterday I cited one. Brad Raffensperger had 31%, with 40% of voters undecided. Instead, in the final returns that we're seeing, he has 52%. And the important thing about that number is if it's above a majority, then he avoids any runoff. And Kate, I guess that's why we don't just go by the polling. I guess that's why they hold the election.
Yes, Kyle, exactly. We did see just a surprising rebuke here, just in the magnitude of it as you're describing. There wasn't much polling, for instance, on the Secretary of State race. And some of the polling we were talking about yesterday cited having about 40% of voters who were undecided. So there was really a lot of voters up for grabs here. But it is remarkable. I don't think many political observers would have predicted a year ago that Raffensperger would have not only held on, but avoided a runoff against Rep. Jody Hice, his challenger. I do think this is a testament to some of the focus that both he and Kemp kept on their campaign. I mean, I think Kemp had it right when he said earlier this week, Trump's mad at me, but I'm not mad at him, and not to get into a slugfest with Trump, because Kemp knew he wanted to win many of Trump's voters, and he clearly did with this huge margin that he had. There were unique features here. I mean, remember that David Perdue managed to lose a Senate runoff in 2021, and Georgia voters want to defeat Stacey Abrams and not think signing up with Perdue is a route to do that. That was what some of the polling was showing. But I really do think it's a testament to the focus and kind of campaign Kemp ran, and also Raffensperger's political survival is just a remarkable event.
One takeaway I have is that this result suggests that the Trump faction of the party is not a majority, and that it might be that President Trump, by getting himself involved in these primaries, is weakening his own political position. Now, remember that Trump says the 2020 election in Georgia was stolen from him. He blames Governor Kemp and Secretary of State Raffensperger. But obviously that argument did not carry the day on Tuesday. And one contrast is with Pennsylvania. And we talked about earlier this month, Pennsylvania had a primary and nominated a gubernatorial candidate, Doug Mastriano. He is a guy who is talking about compromised voting machine companies still. And one difference, though, Mene, in that race is that here in Georgia, we had an incumbent. So it was a head-to-head matchup. And in Pennsylvania, it was an open primary. Mastriano won with 44% of the vote. There were 8 candidates who split the rest. And Pennsylvania doesn't have a runoff law. So if Mastriano had been forced into a runoff, it's not clear he would have necessarily won that race.
Yes, I do think that Kemp's incumbency really was a big factor. He was able to use his governorship to sort of court the support of some potential Perdue allies, and obviously he had a record to run on, and so that made the difference in terms of even a lot of Trump-friendly voters preferring him. But then if you look at Nebraska, they also had a gubernatorial primary, which was open, I believe. You have Ricketts about to retire there, and the sort of non-Trump aligned candidate also pulled through there. And so I do think that it doesn't just come down to incumbency in terms of whether non-Trump aligned candidates are able to sort of rally supporters to their back. I do think that it's an interesting question now, kind of sorting the places where Trump is able to exercise decisive influence over these primaries and where he isn't. As you said, in Pennsylvania, it seems pretty clear both that Mastriano got the nomination sort of based on Trump's support and his alignment with sort of 2020 election conspiracy theories, but also Trump definitely helped to make Dr. Oz a viable candidate there. He was not faring so well in the polls until the endorsement, and he was able to surge. We saw the exact same thing with J.D. Vance in Ohio. I think one distinction that people might look to if they're trying to discern where Trump is able to have an influence versus where he isn't is this a historically strong red state that has a well-developed Republican establishment, or is it one of the more Rust Belt states that until recently was in play for Democrats that Trump really overperformed in and helped to bring into the fold? I think in places like Ohio and Pennsylvania, you have a lot of Republican voters who are very uniquely Trump-friendly, who sort of look to Trump really more than they look to the Republican Party as a representative of the direction they want American politics to go. Whereas in a place like Georgia, you have a very strong establishment and you have a lot of voters who still see the party as having a lot of credibility. I did some reporting in Georgia during the 2021 Senate runoffs, and I remember talking to voters who came out to Kelly Loeffler and David Perdue rallies and asking these voters, do you think of yourself as more of a Trump supporter or do you think of yourself as more of a Republican? And a lot of these voters, even though they liked Trump, were frankly insulted by that question. They thought, I'm a Republican through and through. I've always voted for this party. And they were very happy to potentially back establishment candidates, whereas I think that that would be much less true in a place like Pennsylvania or Ohio. So as we continue with primary season and go into the general, I think that would be a distinction to look for in terms of where Trump appeals most strongly.
Another takeaway to my mind is that we know Republican voters are interested in election integrity. We know they were upset at the ways that voting rules were stretched in the 2020 election. But it seems from this result that Republican officials responding to that can do fine if they stick to the facts. They don't have to entertain these Baroque fraud theories. Secretary of State Raffensperger in particular was quite a Trump antagonist, I think, after the 2020 election. He wrote an op-ed for the Journal comparing Trump's refusal to concede to Stacey Abrams's refusal to concede the Georgia gubernatorial race. Then there was that infamous phone call where Trump called Raffensperger's office and said he was just hoping that they could find 11,000 some votes. And then the leak of that phone call into the media, which became a real controversy. And so Raffensperger was very crosswise with Trump, but he has strongly defended Georgia's law that it passed, tightening up the voting rules. He's called for an amendment to the U.S. Constitution to require citizenship to vote. He began calling for that after New York City started trying to allow, it hasn't quite happened yet, they're still in the process of doing it, but moved to allow non-citizens to vote in local elections. And so, Kate, I mean, that I think is another lesson here is that Republican officials who want to be responsive to those concerns of GOP voters have a lot of things they can say without going down the Trump 2020 fraud path or following Trump down that path.
Right. And I think that Kemp took the concerns about 2020 very seriously and passed a law that would help address them in elections going forward. One result of this is that voters don't want to spend the next 4 years relitigating 2020, but they do want some measures that will keep elections from descending into the same pandemic mess that we saw in 2020. So I do think that Kemp's ability to pass a law and withstand the really withering criticism that was vicious and unfair from Democrats calling it Jim Crow 2.0 really served him well in this campaign. Now, what Trump does here is hard to know. The old military slogan is never reinforce failure. So hopefully he doesn't. And I don't think that Perdue's statement left a lot of room for him to continue this grudge match. But that is one open question here is what lessons Trump will absorb. And if he wants to continue to be a kingmaker in the Republican Party, I think these results are pretty clear. that he's got to choose his battles more wisely and focus on issues that are really more of a broader concern to the electorate right now.
Well, the general election is where I was going to turn next, because President Trump has been pretty vindictive toward Brian Kemp, so much that he's occasionally suggested that he would prefer if Stacey Abrams win that race. At a rally last fall, he said, "Stacey, would you like to take his place? It's okay with me." And as is often true with Trump, it's not clear where exactly to draw the line between when he's joking and when he's being serious. But let me log on to my Truth Social app here this morning and see what Trump is saying about the results. Here's the latest. A very big and successful evening of political endorsements. All wins in Texas, Arkansas, and Alabama. A great new senatorial candidate and others in Georgia. Thank you. Congratulations to all. So no mention there of getting behind Brian Kemp or Secretary Raffensperger for that matter. And so it raises the question that Kate brought up, Monet, which is Trump still so mad at these two candidates that he may try to sabotage the general election?
Well, I think what Trump certainly won't do is get enthusiastically behind either Kemp or Raffensperger in the general election. You're certainly not going to see him say, okay, time to bury the hatchet and unite around a Republican agenda so we can make sure that we hold on to these seats. That is very out of personality for him, and I would frankly be shocked to see him do anything of the sort. I think it's an open question whether he really goes on the warpath against Republican nominees. That's something we haven't seen him do previously in general election contests. And I do think that that would be a breaking point, even with a lot of his most fervent supporters. Many of them prefer Trump to more establishment candidates. Many of them, like Trump, hold Kemp and Raffensperger and similar candidates responsible for not doing enough to change the result of the 2020 election. But they certainly hate Democrats much more than they hate even the most loathsome establishment Republican in their eyes. And I think if they saw Trump acting in a way that was clearly going to result in the election of Stacey Abrams in particular, who has helped to advance sort of really, really wrong-headed and negative narratives about the Republican Party vis-a-vis voter laws, I think that they would be really, really upset with Trump, and it would diminish his prospects for potentially running a 2024 candidacy.
One thing I would add is just that Kemp has helped himself here with his strong victory. I don't see how President Trump can make the argument that the wrong Republican candidate won when Kemp is bringing in 74% of the vote. Hang tight. We'll be right back. You're listening to Potomac Watch from the Wall Street Journal.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. One more thought on Georgia. We have a listener email here from Matthew in Toykio, and he wants to know about the effect of those 2021 Georgia Senate runoffs that Democrats won, including the race that David Perdue, the seat that he lost. And here's what he says. With Georgia midterm discussions on the podcast over the past few weeks, I've heard repeated what-ifs in relation to President Trump's intervention in the January 2021 Georgia Senate races, the result of which gave the Democrats control of the Senate. The implication seems to be that retention of the Senate by the Republicans would have been a good thing. I wonder whether the fact that it permitted so much Democratic overreach was actually a better outcome, both in terms of failure to do more economic damage with Build Back Better and also in terms of Republican outlook for the November midterms. Would love to hear your thoughts. So, Kate, what do you make of that?
Well, Kyle, it might have been good for Republican prospects in the fall to have a better foil to run on here. And it's true that they failed to pass Build Back Better, but that was hardly a foregone conclusion. I don't think that the loss of those two seats was good for the country or good for our political environment. Counterfactuals are always hard to deal with, but the Senate might have spent its time more productively doing things that could actually pass and get 60 votes as opposed to some of these huge spending exercises. I do think there are real consequences. People always forget that a lot of what Congress does is pass appropriations bills, and whether there are 52 Republicans makes a huge difference in, for instance, how much we're going to spend on national defense and other priorities. So perhaps it will help Republicans take back the House this fall, but I do not think these boomerang swings are ultimately good for the country.
I agree. Counterfactual history is interesting, but often difficult to tease out. Another thing that I would point out is the Supreme Court nominee, Ketanji Brown Jackson, who's been confirmed and is waiting in the wings for Justice Stephen Breyer's retirement. And if Republicans had controlled the Senate through that confirmation process, President Biden might have felt more compelled to pick someone closer to the judicial center. And that's a result that will play out over her career on the Supreme Court, which could be 30 or 40 years. So it's very hard to figure out all the implications of that. And the same, I would say, for inflation, Monet. The inflation that we've been seeing, 8.5% year over year, has been fed to some extent by that last $1 trillion COVID bill that the Senate passed under President Biden. And the answer to the question of whether it would be better to have a Republican Senate in part depends on how much that inflation would go down and how much that inflation really matters to the country versus the political advantage that you get from running as a Republican in a November election when you're seeing inflation numbers like that.
Right. I think that, looking at the question from a purely political standpoint, the questioner's probably onto something. I mean, maybe for the past 20 years at this point, we've seen the incumbent president's party get really punished in the midterm elections. And that seems to be related to how far he goes in the direction of advancing his party's top priorities. And so Joe Biden having the Senate majority enabled them to pass, the American Rescue Plan, this COVID spending bill long after the COVID economic emergency had ended. And it enabled the Democrats to sort of even just attempt to pass Build Back Better. And I think all of this has helped voters get a sense that government, and particularly the Democratic Party, is responsible for the inflation we're experiencing right now. But sort of from a policy standpoint, as Kate was alluding to, you always want to sort of be in the position of winning and sort of having the Republicans not be able to block what Democrats were doing sort of obviously enabled some of these policies to be passed. And frankly, you always want to play to win the game. The idea that we are better off in some way for having lost in the recent past is not something I would advise any Republican political strategist to think too hard about.
Well, let's do a brief survey of some of the other races that we hit yesterday. And in Alabama, the Senate primary, we're going to have a runoff. It looks like the latest numbers, Katie Britt is leading with about 45% of the vote. And Mo Brooks is still in it with 29%. And remember, Kate, that Mo Brooks is the candidate that Trump endorsed. And then when he seemed to be struggling, Trump unendorsed him. So maybe we will have to wait and see whether Trump will re-endorse him again.
Yeah, Kyle, hard to say. Turnout appeared to be pretty low at about a quarter. But also here we had a third candidate, Mike Durant, who got about a quarter of the vote. And so he seems to be supporting Brooks. And the question is whether Brooks can consolidate all of that vote and beat Katie Britt. That is hardly a foregone conclusion in my mind, though Brooks seems to be trying to paint her as, a crony of Mitch McConnell, regardless of how fair or not that is. But it is really a surprise, similar to what we saw in Georgia, to see somebody come back. He was polling in the teens for a while, and for him to have made that comeback is a surprise. Last night, he was making Lazarus metaphors. Mo Brooks was. I'll read to you from something on AL.com, which is a local news outlet. He told a gaggle of reporters that he had this plan that his campaign team kind of crushed. We were going to have some pallbearers, he said, and I was going to be in a casket and they were going to bring it out there. And I was going to pop up alive again, not dead as the pundits had projected just a few short weeks ago. For those of us who enjoy political absurdity, that might have been fun, might have gotten him a few more points in the runoff. But I do think this race is very live, and we'll see to what extent Brooks can consolidate that third candidate's support into a primary runoff. But it does show again that voters are looking for more than just a Trump endorsement or a Trump fight. They are kind of thinking through these issues and who they want to represent them in Congress more closely.
Then a little further west in Texas, we have Attorney General incumbent Ken Paxton reelected. Latest figures show he has about 68% of the vote versus George P. Bush with about 32%. And then in that Democratic House race, Henry Cuellar, he's been described as the last pro-life or anti-abortion House Democrat, is facing a former intern of his, Jessica Cisneros, who's a progressive endorsed by Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And there we have a race that is still too close to call, Monet. And if I'm doing the math right, they are divided by 175 votes. Cuellar is leading, but 5% out, so that could go either way.
Yeah, I think that there are important lessons to draw from both of those races you just mentioned. To look at the Cuellar race, it's interesting that people have pointed to the rightward shift of Hispanics in southern Texas, and you have seen Republican candidates able to draw a lot of support from Hispanics who historically have trended Democrat. And so it was always an open question to me, would this rightward shift of Hispanics mean that sort of those who remain in the Democratic Party are more progressive, and that you would see kind of, as you have more Republican support in some of these places, that progressives would be able to consolidate their support over the remnant of their own voters in these primaries. And yet Cuellar's success shows that that hasn't necessarily happened. It's possible that some of these counties might be drifting rightward in general, and his ability to hold off Cisneros, if that does in fact happen, would be sort of an interesting conclusion that I think would force Democrats to sort of revisit their strategy there. And then as far as Paxton versus Bush in the attorney general's race, I think one thing we've seen over the past couple of years is that voters really want a fighter. And increasingly part of the role of attorneys general in states is to stick it to the administration when the president comes from a different party. And Ken Paxton has certainly shown himself willing and able to do that. He's filed lawsuit after lawsuit with some success against the Biden administration. I think George P. Bush tried to pivot in that direction and, suggest that he would be willing to take a more aggressive stance as AG. But people identify him with the Bush family, specifically with his father, Jeb. And I think he was unable to shake off that brand of sort of being a moderate, even if he was trying to posture as being a little bit more aggressive. So I'm not surprised to see that Texas voters went with the sort of more aggressive flavoring Ken Paxton.
One last point I would make is that, boy, it is good to get some solid results on election night. In Georgia, for example, we have 95% of the vote reporting. And so come on, Pennsylvania. This is one of those states. This is my hobby horse where they don't count mail ballots. You're not allowed to process them or pre-process them until the morning of Election Day. And that has real results. Here's another recent post on Truth Social by President Trump. Pennsylvania's count could be a long time in coming. It is all screwed up. Mail ballots are a disaster for America, allows large-scale systematic cheating. And so, Kate, I would make a one last pitch here to the Pennsylvania legislature to try to change some of those provisions, and let's try to get some results on election night, which I think is really in the public interest.
Yeah, Kyle, probably not your last pitch. You'll probably have more opportunities to tell them that, but I agree. There's just a tremendous benefit in getting results you can be confident in on election night. And I think that should be a goal of all states as they try to evaluate their voting policies. I mean, keep in mind that states do a variety of different things. It doesn't always break down on red and blue and who has more early voting or who allows, postmarks by this date. But I do think there are areas of compromise that could increase confidence in the system and get more of these solid results on election night and less of these weeks-long recounts and other events that can really reduce the public's belief that they got a fair result quickly.
Thank you, Kate Monet. Thank you all for listening. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button on your favorite podcast app, and we'll be back tomorrow with another edition of Potomac Watch.